Sometimes, fate rides in on four legs and a cloud of dust. That was the case on the day Charlotte Lane, once a nurse and now just a solitary figure on a sun-bleached ranch, found herself drawn toward the edge of her property by a sound that didn't belong. It was a late afternoon in early autumn, the kind of day where golden light drips through the cottonwoods and shadows stretch across the brittle earth. Charlotte hadn't meant to leave the house. She'd been nursing her own wounds for months since her mother died, tending to memories instead of the land. But that shrill, desperate sound, half scream, half whinny, yanked her from her kitchen like a lasso around her heart. She grabbed her old denim jacket, stepped into her worn boots, and moved quickly across the dust. Her gaze fixed on the distant, weed-choked field beyond her western fence line. The wind carried the stench of neglect. Charlotte's heart hammered as she drew closer, the sharp scent of rot and rust mingling with something wilder, fear, maybe, or the electric pulse of pain. She had seen wounded things before, but never quite like this. There, half collapsed in a patch of shade, was a horse. A Mustang by the look of it. Legs trembling, ribs visible under a filthy hide. Its coat, once the color of storm clouds, was now matted and streaked with mud, burrs, and dried blood. Heavy chains bit into its legs, shackling it to a splintered fence post. Its eyes rolled white and wild, breath coming in harsh, uneven gasps. Charlotte's breath caught. For a long, trembling moment, she stood rooted to the spot, torn between caution and the compulsion to help. She glanced up and down the property lines. She hadn't seen anyone come or go out here for weeks. Whoever owned this land had abandoned it. And this poor creature, too. She inched forward, arms out, voice low and steady. "Hey there." "It's okay," she murmured. "I won't hurt you." The horse shuddered, yanking at the chains, nostrils flaring. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Part of her screamed to go back, to call animal control, the sheriff, someone. But another part, the part that remembered tending to battered soldiers in field hospitals, the part that once soothed her dying mother's trembling hands, refused to turn away. Charlotte scanned the horse's body, noting old scars and fresh wounds. The way its left hind leg bent unnaturally. She spotted a battered feed bucket nearby, empty and full of cigarette butts. Anger burned behind her eyes. Who could do this? She fumbled in her jacket for the multi-tool she always carried, then crouched, moving as slowly as water freezing in winter. The horse's ears flicked back, tail slapping. Any wrong move now and she'd end up with a shattered rib, or worse. A car rumbled down the distant dirt road, dust billowing behind it. Charlotte's head snapped up. Was it the owner? She tensed, ready to bolt, then realized the car passed without slowing. The isolation was complete. Only the wind, the dying weeds, and the silent accusation in the horse's eyes bore witness. Charlotte swallowed hard. "You don't deserve this, do you?" she whispered. "Not one bit." Carefully, she extended a trembling hand, palm up. The horse's lips quivered, uncertain, but didn't strike. It took nearly half an hour, but inch by inch. Charlotte slid forward until her fingers brushed the cold, iron chain. She saw the deep wounds, red, angry flesh where the steel had worn through skin. The horse whinnied, a shrill, hopeless sound, then jerked violently, knocking her backward onto the hard earth. She gasped, wind knocked from her chest, but didn't move to get up. "Easy," she croaked. "I'm not leaving." Grit bit into her knees. The horse pawed the ground, sweat darkening its sides. The late sun slipped behind a cloud, bathing the field in gray. In that silence, Charlotte's memory drifted to her mother's final days, her voice weak but full of determination. Never turn your back on something helpless, Char. Not when you can do something. Not ever. With shaking hands, Charlotte pulled herself upright and tried again. This time she began talking. Nonsense, old lullabies, stories of the ranch, anything to keep the moment soft and human. The horse's breathing slowed, its panic bleeding out by inches. Finally, its head dropped, exhaustion claiming what fear had left behind. Charlotte reached the chain. Her fingers fumbled at the old padlock, slick with grime and blood. Her tool slipped, scraped her knuckles raw. She bit back a curse. Come on, come on. The mechanism finally gave, and with a desperate twist, the chain fell away. The horse didn't bolt. It stood, swaying, head bowed, as if uncertain freedom was real. Charlotte pressed her forehead to its mane, eyes burning. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I promise." In that moment, the walls around her own grief cracked a little. A distant dog barked, and the spell broke. The Mustang took a step, then another, stumbling but following Charlotte's gentle encouragement. She guided it through the field, past rusted farm equipment, back to her own ranch where hope, tattered but alive, waited like a porch light at midnight. Charlotte never looked back. Not even when the shadows stretched long and the world seemed ready to snap in two. The morning after she rescued the broken Mustang, Charlotte Lane stood at the kitchen window, mug of coffee trembling in her hands, and stared at the battered old barn. Inside, Wild Spirit was awake, pacing the shadows, hooves clattering against the hard-packed dirt. She'd barely slept, her dreams tangled with memories. Her mother's voice, flashes of battlefield hospitals, the wild, frantic look in the horse's eyes. Now the ranch felt charged with a nervous energy, as if both woman and animal waited for the other to make the first move. Charlotte finished her coffee and grabbed the bucket of sweet feed. She moved slowly, boots crunching on the frost-bitten grass, heart beating in time with every careful step. The barn was cold and dark, beams streaked with spider webs, the air thick with the sharp, pungent scent of horse sweat and old hay. Wild Spirit stood in the corner, head low, muscles tense. He watched her, eyes still wild, ears flattened against his skull. Charlotte set the bucket down a few feet away, then backed off, giving the Mustang space. She knelt in the straw, arms resting on her knees, and waited. Time slowed to a crawl. The horse inched forward, nostrils flaring. His ribs shivered as if he expected a blow. At last he stretched out his neck and nibbled a mouthful. Charlotte felt her breath loosen. "Good boy," she whispered. "You're safe here." But trust wasn't built in a day. The Mustang flinched from every sound. A creaking board, the wind slamming the barn door, her own soft voice. Charlotte tried not to push. She spoke gently, moved slowly, let him choose the distance. Later that day, as she mucked the stalls, a battered pickup rattled down the driveway, tires grinding gravel. Charlotte's stomach tightened. Through the dirty barn window, she saw Roy Barnes climb out. A tall, heavy-set man with a sour face and a battered cowboy hat pulled low. Roy's boots thudded on the porch. He didn't knock. "Hey, Charlotte!" he bellowed. "We need to talk, now!" She wiped her hands and stepped outside, closing the barn door behind her. "Morning, Roy," she said, keeping her voice even. He sneered. "That's my horse you got locked up in there. Folks around here know it. You think you can just steal him?" Charlotte bristled. "I didn't steal anything, Roy. That horse was chained up, half-starved, left to die. Someone had to do something." Roy's face flushed purple. He's a wild one. Dangerous. You're out of your mind if you think you can keep him. The law's on my side. You'll regret this. She crossed her arms. If you really cared, you'd have taken better care of him. I won't let you hurt him again. He leaned in, breath sour with tobacco. You're making a mistake. His words were a low, venomous growl. This isn't over. As he stomped back to his truck, Charlotte's hands shook. She watched him drive away, dust spiraling behind him. The whole ranch seemed to hold its breath. By noon, the news had spread. When Charlotte went into town for supplies, she caught the looks, the whispers at the feed store, the way people stepped back, eyes darting. Some shook their heads, murmuring, "Crazy old Lane." Others just watched in silence. Only Ruth Miller, her nearest neighbor, offered a sympathetic nod. Back at the ranch, Charlotte locked the gates and checked the fences twice. She tried to hide her nerves, moving through the chores on autopilot, but she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. That evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon, a storm rolled in, lightning crackling in the distance, wind whipping across the plains. Charlotte hurried to secure the barn, her lantern casting strange shadows. Suddenly, the dog barked. A sharp, warning sound. Headlights flashed through the trees. Charlotte's heart leapt. She grabbed the shotgun from above the mantel, just in case, and ran outside. 3 men, faces shadowed by hats, stood by Roy's truck at the edge of her property. One of them, taller than the rest, called out, "We're here for the horse, ma'am. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Charlotte's grip tightened on the shotgun. "Get off my land," she said, voice steady. "You're trespassing." Roy stepped forward. "I warned you. That horse is mine. Hand him over, or things'll get ugly." Thunder boomed, the air thick with rain. Charlotte glanced toward the barn. Wild Spirit whinnied, a raw, terrified sound. She took a step back, heart hammering. The men moved closer. She leveled the shotgun. "I called the sheriff," she shouted. "He's on his way." The men hesitated, uncertain. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the wind and the distant wail of sirens. Had she actually dialed? She didn't remember, but she prayed the bluff would work. Then, lights flashed at the end of the road, red and blue, spinning through the trees. The men scattered, Roy cursing as he scrambled for his truck. Charlotte stood in the rain, shoulders shaking, until the patrol car pulled up and the sheriff stepped out. "You all right, Charlotte?" he called. She nodded, breathless. "I am now." When the sheriff left, Charlotte went to the barn. Wild Spirit stood trembling, but as she knelt by his stall, he didn't flinch away. She reached out, fingers brushing his mane, and felt a fragile, unspoken trust settle between them. The storm raged outside, but inside, for the first time, they faced it together. Rain hammered the ranch roof through the night, tapping out a restless rhythm that echoed Charlotte's own tangled thoughts. Dawn came gray and cold, with the land slick from the storm and the scent of wet earth rising through the air. When Charlotte finally emerged, bleary-eyed but resolute, she found Ruth Miller already waiting by the gate, arms folded, raincoat flapping in the wind. Ruth was the sort of neighbor you counted on. 60, sharp-eyed, voice always a little dry, but heart enormous. She greeted Charlotte with a quiet, "You okay?" and didn't flinch at the tired shadows under Charlotte's eyes. "I'm still standing," Charlotte replied, managing a small smile. "So's Wild Spirit." The 2 women made their way to the barn, boots squelching in the mud. Inside, Wild Spirit stood at the far end of his stall, gaze wary but less frantic than before. Ruth took him in with a steady look, then turned to Charlotte. "He's still scared." Charlotte nodded. "I can't blame him." Ruth set her bag down, pulling out bandages, a bottle of antiseptic, and a couple of apples. "Let's see if he'll let us near." It was slow, deliberate work. Charlotte murmuring comfort, Ruth moving with the calm of someone who'd patched up more than a few battered animals. Wild Spirit flinched from their touch at first, teeth bared and eyes wide. But hunger and exhaustion kept him from lashing out. Ruth's hands, weathered but sure, cleaned the wounds where chains had bitten, and Charlotte dabbed them dry, fingers gentle as falling snow. "Someone hurt him bad," Ruth said softly, voice rough with anger. "Folks can be cruel." Charlotte's jaw tightened. "Not anymore." As they worked, Wild Spirit's breathing slowed, shivers quieting beneath their hands. Charlotte fed him small pieces of apple, which he took with trembling lips. It was the first time she'd seen a hint of trust in his eyes. Fragile, uncertain, but real. The days blurred together. Charlotte slipped into a rhythm she hadn't known she missed. Waking with the sun, tending to Wild Spirit's wounds, talking softly as she moved around the barn. Sometimes Ruth joined her, bringing fresh bread or stories from town. Her presence a buffer against the loneliness that still haunted the old farmhouse. At first, Wild Spirit barely moved from his corner, muscles knotted with tension. He ate only when Charlotte left the stall and slept with one eye open, as if expecting the world to break apart again. Charlotte understood that kind of fear. She carried her own ghosts, after all. But she kept showing up day after day, letting him see that she wasn't going anywhere. One afternoon, as she brushed the dust from his coat, Wild Spirit let out a long sigh and dropped his head against her shoulder. Charlotte froze, afraid to even breathe. She reached up and stroked his mane, feeling the heat of his skin and the steady thrum of his heart. The barn was quiet except for the soft rustle of hay, the rhythm of two living things learning to trust. It was then that Charlotte began to feel the old ache in her chest ease, just a little. She realized how much she'd missed this. Connection. Purpose. The silent language that passed between broken souls. She started talking to Wild Spirit about her mother, about the war, about the ache of empty rooms and nights that seemed to last forever. Sometimes, late at night, Charlotte would find herself at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, listening for the horse's breath through the window. She realized she wasn't just healing Wild Spirit. She was healing herself, too, bit by bit. Ruth noticed the change. "You seem lighter," she remarked one morning, sipping her coffee on the porch. Charlotte looked out at the barn, watching sunlight slant across the door. "Maybe I am," she replied. "He's teaching me more than I ever expected." There were setbacks, of course. Wild Spirit spooked at sudden noises, sometimes bucking or slamming into the stall door when the wind howled or an engine backfired on the road. On those days, Charlotte had to remind herself to be patient, to let him come to her, to offer comfort, but never force it. One night, as another storm rolled in, Wild Spirit started pacing, sweat gleaming on his flanks. Charlotte sat with him for hours, humming old lullabies until his panic ebbed, and he rested his nose in her lap. Rain battered the roof, but inside the barn, there was peace. The small victories added up. Wild Spirit ate from Charlotte's hand without flinching, allowed her to clean his wounds, even followed her outside into the paddock when the sun returned. Charlotte watched his steps grow surer, his eyes calmer, and felt something stubborn and hopeful blossom in her own heart. One evening, as the sky turned to lavender, Ruth arrived with her grandkids, two shy children who'd heard whispers in town about the crazy horse lady and her wild Mustang. Charlotte hesitated, but Ruth grinned. They'll be gentle. To everyone's amazement, Wild Spirit let the children approach, their hands outstretched and faces wide with awe. He sniffed their fingers, nibbled at a carrot, then stood quietly as they giggled and stroked his mane. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. She glanced at Ruth, who winked. See, he's not the only one learning to trust again. That night, as the stars came out and the land settled into silence, Charlotte lingered in the barn, her hand on Wild Spirit's neck. She thought about second chances, about broken things finding new purpose, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. The sharp bite of winter faded, giving way to gentle golden days where the wind lost its edge and the world outside Charlotte's window softened. It was in those quiet days, where morning sun spilled across the porch and the scent of hay mixed with wildflowers, that Charlotte began to feel the old boundaries of her world stretch and shift. Ruth was the first to suggest opening the ranch to others. They were sitting together at the kitchen table, sharing a pot of coffee and listening to Wild Spirit nicker in the paddock just beyond the window. Ruth's eyes sparkled above her mug. You know, Char, this place used to feel like the heart of the valley. Kids everywhere, laughter, families, back before the world got so closed in. Charlotte stared at the rising steam, a tightness in her chest. I'm not sure people would come anymore. Folks talk. You know that better than anyone. Ruth shrugged. Let them talk. You've got something here. Something worth sharing. She reached out, squeezed Charlotte's hand. Open the gates again. Let people see what's possible. It took days for Charlotte to muster the courage. She mended the broken sign by the mailbox, Lane Ranch, scrubbing away years of grime. She swept the porch, mowed the wild grass, and patched the sagging fence posts. Ruth helped, showing up with her grandkids, bringing a slow, determined energy that infected the whole place with purpose. Charlotte placed a handwritten note on the community board in town. Ranch open for visits, kids welcome. Learn about horses, kindness, and second chances. It was simple, no grand promises, just an invitation. The first week, only Ruth's grandchildren showed up, wide-eyed and careful, bringing apple slices and nervous laughter. But word spread quickly. By the next Saturday, a trickle of neighbors arrived, parents shepherding children who peeked around Charlotte's legs, teens daring each other to pet the wild Mustang, even old men from the feed store who claimed to have seen it all, but still watched with wonder as Wild Spirit pranced the fence line. At first, Wild Spirit was wary. He kept his distance, nostrils flared, eyes sharp with memory. The children, sensing his fear, mirrored Charlotte's own patience. They sat in the grass, whispering stories, scattering bits of apple and carrots, waiting with open palms. Day after day, Wild Spirit grew bolder. He approached a little closer, head lowered, ears flicking at the smallest sound. There were setbacks. Loud noises sent him racing to the far end of the paddock, and too many reaching hands left him trembling in the corner. Charlotte learned to set boundaries, explaining gently, "Let him come to you. Give him time." One bright afternoon, a girl named Lucy, no older than 10, sat quietly at the paddock's edge. She hummed a lullaby, voice shaky but sweet. Wild Spirit inched forward, nostrils twitching, drawn by something gentle and familiar. Charlotte held her breath as the Mustang paused just beyond reach, then, in a moment that seemed to hold the entire world, nudged Lucy's outstretched hand with his nose. The ranch erupted in soft applause. Lucy beamed, her eyes shining. "He likes music," she said, grinning at Charlotte. From then on, music became part of the daily ritual. Children sang, parents clapped along, and the ranch rang with the sound of laughter and hope. Wild Spirit became a living lesson, a reminder that trust could be rebuilt, even after the worst betrayals. Charlotte found herself swept into the rhythms of community again. She led tours, taught kids how to brush a horse, told stories about wild Mustangs and second chances. She laughed more, shared meals on the porch with neighbors, and even started a kindness wall in the barn, where visitors pinned notes and drawings for Wild Spirit and each other. One afternoon, Ruth found Charlotte staring out at a group of children clustered around Wild Spirit, their faces glowing in the late sun. "You did this, Char," Ruth said softly. "You brought this place back to life." Charlotte shook her head, but Ruth just smiled. "Let yourself believe it." Still, not everyone in town was on her side. Some muttered about the crazy woman and her wild horse, warning their kids to keep away. Roy Barnes, especially, made his presence known, lurking on the far side of the fence, arms crossed, face like thunder. But Charlotte stood her ground, bolstered by the support of those who'd seen the change with their own eyes. There were hard days. Once, a group of teenagers tried to scare Wild Spirit by throwing rocks at the fence. Charlotte caught them, her voice low and furious. "This is a place for healing, not hate. You want to learn something? You're welcome here. Otherwise, get gone." They left, chastened, word spreading fast that Lane Ranch was not a place for cruelty. Slowly, the stories outgrew the rumors. Parents spoke of their shy children blossoming, of lessons in patience and empathy. Teens who once rolled their eyes now volunteered to muck stalls or paint fences, eager for Wild Spirit's quiet approval. Even the sheriff's daughter started coming by after school, bringing fresh carrots and a stubborn determination that reminded Charlotte of herself at that age. Through it all, Wild Spirit changed. He grew stronger, muscles filling out, coat gleaming. He learned to accept gentle hands, even allowed Charlotte to slip a soft halter over his head, though she never pushed him further than he was willing to go. The bond between them deepened, a silent understanding that needed no words. As the season turned, Charlotte realized she wasn't just rebuilding a ranch. She was rebuilding a life, both hers and Wild Spirit's, one act of trust at a time. And as the sun set behind the hills, painting the world in gold and shadow, she finally let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, the best days were still ahead. The days grew warmer, but the feeling of safety Charlotte had built on Lane Ranch was suddenly as fragile as a bird's egg. She sensed it first in the glances that lasted a little too long at the grocery store, the way voices fell quiet when she walked into the post office. The whispers had returned, fueled by Roy Barnes and his angry pride, seeping through the cracks of the community Charlotte had only just begun to rejoin. It started with the rumors. Roy moved through town, talking in low tones at the diner, the hardware store, anywhere folks would listen. "She stole my horse," he'd say, slamming his mug on the counter. "That Mustang was on my land. Always was. Woman like that has no business keeping a wild thing." Some believed him. They remembered Charlotte's grief after her mother's death, the way she'd withdrawn and left the ranch to weeds and silence. It was easier for some to believe the worst than to accept that healing could grow in the ruins. The tension trickled down to the ranch. Parents called with questions that were barely veiled accusations. Is it true you took that horse from Roy? Are our kids safe out there? Charlotte answered each one with a steady voice, but behind closed doors, her hands trembled. The warmth she'd fought so hard to bring back felt threatened by an old, familiar cold. Ruth tried to reassure her. Don't let them in your head, she said, sitting on the porch one morning. You're doing right, Char. They'll see it in time. But Charlotte's old fears gnawed at her resolve. She spent sleepless nights double-checking the locks and walking the fence lines, her flashlight beam carving out pools of pale light in the dark. She wondered if she'd been foolish to believe she and Wild Spirit could ever escape their scars. Then one morning, she woke to a different kind of silence. The ranch felt wrong, like a note played flat. She found the main gate hanging open, chains snapped, and fresh tire tracks cut deep in the mud. Her heart lurched. She ran for the paddock, her boots splashing through puddles, just in time to see Wild Spirit's stall door swinging wide, the straw inside torn and scattered. He was gone. Charlotte's mind raced. She called Ruth, voice shaking. He's missing, the gate. Someone took him, or he ran. Ruth was at the ranch in minutes, eyes hard and jaw set. Together they scoured the property, finding boot prints near the back fence, cigarette butts ground into the dirt, and a piece of blue denim snagged on a nail. Roy's men, Ruth muttered, fists clenched. He said he'd take him back. Charlotte tried to call the sheriff, but the phone lines were down. Storm damage, the operator said. She wanted to scream. Instead, she grabbed Wild Spirit's halter, threw on her jacket, and began following the tracks leading into the woods beyond her land. The search stretched through tangled brush and knee-deep mud, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods seemed to close in, every snapped twig or rustling branch a cruel reminder of how alone she was. Ruth followed, flashlight in hand, her own fear hidden behind grit and determination. Suddenly, a shout rang out in the distance. Then the crash of hooves. Charlotte and Ruth plunged deeper into the trees, hearts pounding. They emerged in a clearing to find Wild Spirit caught between the broken rails of a fallen fence, sides heaving, flanks flecked with sweat and blood. 3 men stood nearby, Roy and 2 others, trying to corner him with ropes and curses. Charlotte's rage flared, hot and wild. She strode forward, voice cracking like thunder. "Get away from him! This isn't your land!" "Roy!" Roy spun, face twisted with triumph and spite. "You lost, Lane. He belongs to me. Always has." Ruth stepped up beside Charlotte, phone raised. "I'm filming this, Roy. Sheriff will see everything." The threat gave the men pause, but Roy sneered. "Sheriff's not here now, is he? You think this changes anything?" At that moment, Wild Spirit reared, eyes wild, teeth bared. The ropes fell away. Roy's men stumbled back, one cursing as he tripped in the mud. Charlotte kept her voice low, reaching for the horse with outstretched hands. "Come on, boy. I'm here." She knelt in the mud, ignoring Roy's shouting, whispering the lullabies that had soothed Wild Spirit before. Slowly, trembling, he stepped toward her, nostrils flaring, and pressed his head into her chest. Charlotte buried her face in his mane, relief and gratitude washing through her. Roy stood there, powerless, anger shaking his frame. "You can't keep him. This isn't over." Charlotte straightened, meeting his glare. "If you cared about him, You wouldn't have left him chained and starving. He's not a prize to be fought over. He's a living soul, and he chooses where he belongs. With Ruth filming, Roy had no choice but to retreat, cursing as he stormed away. His men followed, shooting resentful glances over their shoulders. The woods grew quiet again, except for Charlotte's uneven breathing and the soft snort of Wild Spirit beside her. But the damage was done. News of the confrontation spread through town. Some rallied behind Charlotte, moved by her courage. Others doubled down on their suspicion, siding with Roy and whispering about stolen property and old grudges. That night, as Charlotte tended to Wild Spirit's new scrapes in the barn, she felt the weight of every eye in town pressing against her walls. Yet as the Mustang leaned into her touch, trust shining in his tired eyes, Charlotte found her strength again. They would face whatever came, together. Dusk fell heavy and gray over Lane Ranch, painting the world in long shadows and bruised light. Inside, Charlotte sat at her kitchen table, the day's newspaper spread before her, but unread. Her mind churned with worry. Wild Spirit had been uneasy all afternoon, skittish, pacing the paddock as if sensing the tension that still hung in the air since Roy's last ugly visit. The phone calls from supportive neighbors helped, but every time a car rumbled down the distant road, Charlotte's pulse quickened, never sure if it would be a friend or a threat. As the last of the daylight faded, a storm gathered on the horizon. Wind rattled the windows, rain tapped nervously on the tin roof, and thunder rolled through the distant hills like drums. Charlotte glanced at the old clock on the wall. Nearly 9. She should have felt safe with Wild Spirit tucked away in the barn, but unease gnawed at her. She stepped outside, flashlight in hand, boots splashing through puddles. Each breath tasted of rain and something sharper, fear. She reached the barn just as the first lightning split the sky. Wild Spirit stood near the door, his muscles tense, nostrils flaring. He tossed his head, eyes rolling white. Charlotte stroked his mane, voice low. "It's all right. I'm here. We're safe." A crack sounded in the distance, something not quite thunder. Charlotte froze. The dog barked outside, urgent and wild. She rushed out, heart pounding, the beam of her flashlight swinging across the field. The back gate hung open, chain loose. Panic shot through her. Wild Spirit. Had someone come for him again? Without thinking, Charlotte ran back into the barn, only to find the Mustang trembling by the stall door, ready to bolt. "Easy, boy, easy," she pleaded. But he shoved past her, hooves slipping on the wet floor, and crashed out into the storm. Charlotte followed, rain lashing her face, calling his name into the wind. She fumbled for her phone, hands shaking, and dialed Ruth. "He's gone. Wild Spirit's loose. I think someone spooked him or tried to break in." Ruth's answer was immediate. "I'm on my way. Stay safe. I'll bring a lantern. We'll find him." Charlotte grabbed her coat, flashlight, and Wild Spirit's halter. She darted toward the edge of the woods, calling his name over and over, listening for any sign. Darkness pressed in, the storm swallowing sound and sight alike. Branches whipped her arms. Brambles snagged her jeans, but she kept moving, driven by fear and fierce determination. Rain turned the world to mud, swallowing her boots with each step. Thunder echoed through the trees. Somewhere ahead, she heard the distant crash of hooves, a flash of movement as Wild Spirit disappeared deeper into the woods. Charlotte stumbled after him, slipping, her flashlight beam dancing wildly. She called, begged, pleaded, her voice hoarse. tears lost in the rain. At times, she caught glimpses of him, the shimmer of his mane in the lightning, the pale streak of his flanks vanishing behind a tree. But always he stayed just out of reach, wild and terrified, running from pain and shadows only he could see. Minutes stretched into hours. Charlotte's breath came ragged, her body aching with cold and exhaustion. She fought the urge to break down, clinging to the memory of Wild's spirit pressing his head into her shoulder, trusting her when the rest of the world had failed. She wouldn't let him be lost again, not to the storm, not to the past. Suddenly a light flickered through the trees. Ruth, her lantern bobbing as she picked her way through the underbrush. "Charlotte!" she called, her voice a lifeline. "Any sign?" "Up ahead," Charlotte gasped, pointing toward a rocky creek bed where the water ran high and wild with rain. "He went this way. I saw him." Together the two women pressed on, shouting Wild Spirit's name into the howling night. At last, they heard it. A whinny, high and broken, not far from the rushing creek. Charlotte rushed forward, nearly sliding down the muddy bank, and there he was. Wild Spirit, trembling, sides heaving, trapped by the slick stones on the far side of the water. Charlotte's heart cracked. She saw the blood on his leg, a gash, deep but not deadly, likely from a jagged rock. He backed away, eyes wide, breath coming in shallow bursts. Charlotte didn't move closer. She dropped to her knees in the mud, voice soft and steady despite the panic rising in her throat. "I'm here, boy. I'm not going to hurt you." Rain pounded her shoulders. Ruth stood a little ways back, shining her light gently. Charlotte reached into her pocket, pulled out an apple, offering it palm up, her hand shaking. "You remember this, don't you? It's safe. Come on, please." Minutes passed, long, aching minutes with nothing but the roar of the creek and the storm all around them. Finally, Wild Spirit's ears twitched. He limped a step closer, head low. Charlotte kept talking, letting the sound of her voice fill the emptiness. "You're not alone anymore. Not ever again." Another step, then another. He pressed his nose into her hand, lips trembling as he took the apple. Charlotte sobbed, relief flooding her as she stroked his mane, feeling the thunder in his heart and her own. Carefully, she examined the wound, wrapping it as best she could with a strip torn from her shirt. Ruth called from the bank. "Take it slow. Let him come when he's ready." Charlotte waited, the rain soaking through to her bones. She didn't force, didn't beg, just stayed with him, letting trust grow in the space between heartbeats. At last, Wild Spirit nudged her shoulder, as if asking for help. Charlotte guided him across the stones, supporting his weight, whispering encouragement with every step. When they finally reached Ruth's side, Wild Spirit slumped against Charlotte, exhausted but alive. The three of them, woman, friend, and horse, stood in the storm's aftermath, battered but unbroken. They made their way home together, the lantern's glow bobbing through the dark. When they reached the ranch, Charlotte led Wild Spirit into the barn, drying him with old towels, tending to his wound with Ruth's gentle help. The Mustang never once shied away. Outside, the storm spent itself, leaving behind only a hush, a promise of new beginnings, hard-won through courage and faith. Charlotte stroked Wild Spirit's mane, her own tears lost among the raindrops. "You came back to me." He lifted his head, pressing it to her shoulder, and in that moment, Charlotte understood. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is wait, trust, and believe that those you love will find their way home. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered. The ranch lay silent in the pale blue of dawn, dew silvering the grass, every leaf and rail glistening in the morning light. Charlotte sat in the barn beside Wild Spirit, exhaustion pulling at her bones, but relief keeping her awake. She had barely slept, spending the night tending his wound, whispering soft reassurances as he dozed, his body pressed close as if to remind them both. He was home. Ruth brought coffee and a warm biscuit before the sun had fully risen. "You two made it through another night," she said, voice full of tired pride. Charlotte accepted the mug with a grateful smile. Wild Spirit's eyes were gentler, the wild terror replaced by a wary peace. As Charlotte brushed the mud from his flanks, he nickered softly, stretching his neck toward her with something like gratitude. In that moment, Charlotte felt a fierce, protective love. This horse was more than a rescue. He was family now. Their quiet was shattered by the low growl of a truck's engine on the drive. Ruth's hand tightened on Charlotte's arm. "He's back." The old blue pickup crunched over gravel and screeched to a halt at the edge of the property. Roy Barnes climbed out, his shape bulky in the morning light, two men at his back. The lines of his face were hard, his jaw set in grim determination. He marched toward the barn, his boots muddy, his eyes fixed on Charlotte. Charlotte stepped outside, squaring her shoulders. Ruth was beside her, unyielding. A handful of neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began to gather by the fence. The sheriff's car crested the hill moments later, lights flashing but sirens silent, adding weight to the dawn's tension. Roy stopped a few feet away, folding his arms across his chest. "I'm not leaving without my horse," he said, voice like gravel. "You got no right to keep him, Charlotte, no matter what story you tell." Charlotte felt the eyes of her neighbors, the law and the rising sun on her face. She forced herself to meet Roy's glare. "You lost the right to Wild Spirit when you chained him up and left him to die. He's not property. He's not yours. He chose to come back here." Roy's face flushed with anger. "You think a wild animal can choose? You think you know what's best for him?" "I know what kindness looks like," Charlotte said, her voice trembling but clear. "And so does he." The men behind Roy bristled, but the sheriff strode forward. Sheriff McKinley was a big man, quiet but respected, his gaze sweeping over everyone. "Morning, folks. What's going on?" Roy jabbed a finger toward the barn. "She stole my horse, Sheriff. I want him back. Law's on my side." Charlotte lifted her chin. "Ask anyone here, Sheriff. Ask the kids who've seen what Wild Spirit's been through. Ask Ruth. I found him chained and starving. I nursed him back to health. He's part of this community now." A murmur ran through the crowd. Ruth stepped forward, voice ringing clear. "I saw it all, Sheriff. Roy abandoned that horse. Charlotte saved him. We all know it." The sheriff considered, his eyes lingering on Wild Spirit, then on Charlotte and Roy. "Animals aren't just things, Roy," he said at last. "And you can't treat them like garbage and expect to get them back just because you want to." Roy's fists clenched. "You're making a mistake. This is theft." Charlotte held her ground, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. "If you want to hurt someone, hurt me. But you're not touching him again." Silence fell, thick as smoke. Charlotte saw the doubt flicker in Roy's eyes. He looked at Wild Spirit, who stood calmly beside her, battered but proud. As if he too knew the outcome hung in the balance. Sheriff McKinley finally spoke, his voice firm. I've got statements from half the town that you neglected that horse, Roy. I've seen the wounds myself. Unless you want to go to court and answer for that, I'm ruling right now. Wild Spirit stays here with Charlotte. Cheers and applause rippled through the neighbors by the fence. Ruth squeezed Charlotte's hand. Even the sheriff's deputy smiled, tipping his hat. Roy glared, his rage turning to defeat. You all think you're so high and mighty, he spat, backing away. This isn't the last you'll hear from me? But as he stalked to his truck, the men who'd come with him hesitated, then drifted toward the crowd, unwilling to follow a man who'd lost more than just a horse. Charlotte let out a shaky breath. Wild Spirit nuzzled her shoulder, and she hugged his neck, tears slipping down her cheeks. Quiet, grateful, free. Ruth wiped her own eyes, chuckling. Looks like you're officially a troublemaker, Char. Neighbors gathered around, offering hugs, promises to help rebuild, and praise for Charlotte's courage. Children clung to the paddock rails, whispering to Wild Spirit, whose calm presence made him seem twice as large and wise in the soft morning light. Sheriff McKinley came over and placed a hand on Charlotte's shoulder. You did right, Charlotte. We need more folks willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Charlotte smiled, the tension at last beginning to ease. She looked out at the crowd, her friends, her community, and finally felt that she belonged again. As the sun rose higher, banishing the last of the storm, Charlotte, Ruth, and Wild Spirit stood together, strong against whatever darkness might come. The battle for the horse's future was over. The path ahead was theirs to choose. And as Charlotte ran her hand along Wild Spirit's mane, she whispered, "You're home, and so am I." The summer after the standoff dawned warm and hopeful, the valley echoing with sounds that hadn't been heard in years. Children's laughter, the steady clop of hooves, the easy rhythm of neighbors working together. Word of Charlotte's fight for Wild Spirit had spread, and what began as whispers of scandal became stories of courage, rippling through the county and bringing people to Lane Ranch with hands open and hearts curious. Charlotte's mornings started early, sunlight streaming through kitchen windows as she brewed coffee and planned the day. Wild Spirit waited at the paddock fence, eyes bright, his coat heeled and glistening, a living symbol of resilience. Sometimes Charlotte would pause, cup in hand, and marvel at how much had changed, how the pain of the past had seeded something new and quietly powerful. The ranch was no longer just hers. After the sheriff's ruling, folks who'd once kept their distance began to offer help. Mr. Dear Larkin from the feed store brought lumber and nails, his teenage sons eager to build something real. The Johnson twins painted the barn's old fence, splattering each other with more whitewash than the wood received. Mrs. Kim arrived with flowers and tomato seedlings for the kitchen garden, her youngest daughter giggling as she handed Charlotte a hand-drawn card. Even Sheriff McKinley stopped by after his shift, hammer in hand, gruffly insisting on fixing the sagging front steps. Together, they rebuilt what had been broken. The paddock was reinforced and expanded, fresh hay stacked high in the loft, a new shelter raised for Wild Spirit and any future rescues. Ruth, always at Charlotte's side, suggested building a notice board. For lost pets, good deeds, and news about the ranch, she said. It soon overflowed with thank you notes, drawings, and offers from kids wanting to help with chores. But it wasn't just fences and barns that were mended. Something deeper took root. Children arrived in groups, some shy, some boisterous, each carrying a story, bullied at school, lonely after a parent's divorce, new in town, and uncertain. Charlotte welcomed them all, showing how to fill feed buckets, brush Wild Spirit's mane, and moved gently around the animals. Wild Spirit, once wary and wild, stood patient as small hands stroked his nose, as soft voices confided secrets that belonged only to the barn. He became a teacher, wordless, wise, and steady. Children who struggled to trust people found confidence in his calm acceptance. When a boy named Ethan, speechless from grief after losing his dog, crept close and laid a trembling palm against Wild Spirit's neck, the horse stood so still you'd have thought he understood every unsaid word. Later, Ethan's mother wept in the kitchen, thanking Charlotte for the first smile she'd seen in months. Other animals found their way to the ranch. An old mule abandoned by the highway, a litter of kittens rescued from a culvert, a battered goat left behind by moving neighbors. Charlotte never turned any away. She organized the barn into a haven, each creature given a name and a purpose, each child or adult who helped discovering something inside themselves they'd thought was lost. Ruth's grandkids started a garden patch, learning patience as they coaxed green shoots from the hard ground. Teens who'd once mocked the crazy horse lady now volunteered to fix fences and muck stalls, finding unexpected pride in the honest work. Parents lingered by the paddock, talking over coffee, sharing advice and hard-earned wisdom. Some evenings, neighbors brought guitars and homemade pies, and under a blanket of stars, laughter carried across the fields. Not every day was easy. Sometimes Wild Spirit would still panic at a sudden noise, the old fear flashing in his eyes. On those days, Charlotte sat with him, humming lullabies, reminding him that he was safe, that healing took time. She shared this truth with others, kids learning to forgive, parents mending old hurts, even herself, as she continued to let the warmth of the community melt the last ice from her heart. The ranch became a place for second chances, not just for animals, but for people too. News of its work spread, bringing visitors from other towns, each with their own wounds and hopes. Local teachers brought students for field trips, using Wild Spirit's story to teach compassion and resilience. At a small sign near the gate, painted by Charlotte's own hand, were the words, "A sanctuary for the broken, all welcome." Wild Spirit stood at the heart of it all, his scars a badge of survival, his gentle presence an anchor for the uncertain and the hurting. There were days he galloped across the pasture, mane flying, and the sight would draw applause and cheers from those watching, each child, each adult seeing in his freedom a reflection of their own longings. Charlotte sometimes caught herself watching from the porch, Ruth by her side, the sounds of joy and healing drifting on the breeze. "Did you ever think it'd be like this?" Ruth would ask, her eyes shining. Charlotte shook her head, a smile growing despite herself. "No, but I'm glad it is." In the hush of evening, as the ranch settled and the sky faded to deep blue, Charlotte walked the paddock one last time. She found Wild Spirit waiting for her at the gate. She leaned against him, breathing in the sweet scent of grass and horse, feeling the steady thump of his heart. "We did it, didn't we?" she whispered. He nuzzled her shoulder, warm and solid and true. In that moment, Charlotte understood. This place, this life, this family of misfits and menders was exactly where they both belonged. By late summer, the ranch had become a living testament to transformation. Wild Spirit grazed beneath a wide sky, his coat gleaming with health. The wildness in his eyes softened into something wiser, a watchfulness that spoke of survival, but also of peace. The barn buzzed with quiet activity, children giggling as they chased kittens, Ruth organizing a box of fresh carrots, neighbors fixing a wobbly gate. Yet for all the outward change, it was the inner shifts, gentle and seismic, that Charlotte noticed most. One evening, as dusk painted the world in lavender and gold, Charlotte found herself on the porch beside Ruth, each with a mug of tea warming their hands. The air was heavy with the scent of wildflowers, crickets singing their twilight chorus. Charlotte let the silence stretch, comforted by the company of her friend and the gentle hum of life all around. Ruth broke the quiet first. "You seem different, Char. Lighter. Like the past isn't weighing you down the way it used to." Charlotte watched Wild Spirit moving slowly in the paddock, his head dipping low to the grass. "I think I finally understand what Mom meant," she said. "She always said healing isn't a straight line. I wanted to fix everything, all at once. But life's not like that. There are setbacks, old wounds that ache when it rains, days when fear still creeps in." Ruth nodded. "I know what you mean. Sometimes it's just about showing up again and again, even when it hurts." Charlotte smiled, glancing sideways. "You think people will remember what happened here? Not the fights or the rumors, but the good we tried to do?" Ruth's answer was certain. "Of course they will. Folks might talk, might doubt, but kindness echoes longer than gossip ever could. This ranch, Wild Spirit, you, these are stories worth telling." As the sky darkened, Charlotte's mind drifted back over the long, winding road that brought her here. She saw her mother's face, lined with pain but still full of stubborn hope. She remembered the long nights beside Wild Spirit, singing lullabies through her own tears, feeling the silent bond grow between them. She remembered the fear of loss, of failure, of never being enough. But now, in the hush of evening, those fears seemed smaller, tamed by time and effort and the slow, patient work of trust. Inside the barn, she found Ethan, quiet, thoughtful Ethan, sitting on an overturned bucket, a kitten curled in his lap. "Do you think Wild Spirit will always remember being hurt?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte knelt beside him, stroking the Mustang's mane. "I think he'll always remember, but remembering isn't the same as being broken. Sometimes the things that hurt us teach us the most important lessons." Ethan looked up, hopeful. "Like what?" "Like how strong you are. How to be gentle with others. That healing takes time, but it's always possible if you don't give up." Ethan nodded, a smile flickering across his lips. The kitten purred, Wild Spirit snorted softly, and Charlotte felt a sense of purpose so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Later that week, Charlotte and Ruth sat together under the cottonwoods, sorting through letters from people who'd heard about Lane Ranch, some asking for advice, others sharing their own stories of loss and resilience. One woman wrote, "You gave me hope that I could start over, even after everything I've lost." Another thanked Charlotte for teaching her son what real courage looks like. Charlotte read each letter slowly, letting the words settle deep. She realized the ranch was more than a sanctuary for animals. It was a place where broken people came to remember their own worth, to find comfort in shared stories and small acts of kindness. One afternoon, Charlotte took a walk down the old fence line, remembering the first day she'd found Wild Spirit, chained, battered, afraid. She recalled the panic in his eyes, the fear in her own heart, and how close she'd come to walking away. She understood now that the bravest things she'd ever done were quiet ones, refusing to turn back, choosing patience over anger, standing up for Wild Spirit even when no one believed in her. She'd learned, too, that sometimes healing meant letting go of control. Wild Spirit had taught her that trust couldn't be forced, It had to be earned, with gentle hands and endless patience. There were days she wanted to shout at the world, to demand it change faster, but she'd learned to wait, to breathe, to let healing unfold in its own time. Ruth found her at the fence, hands deep in her pockets. "Lost in thought?" she asked. Charlotte laughed softly. "Just grateful. I spent so long thinking I had to be strong, had to fix everything. Now I think real strength is just not giving up, even when it would be easier." Ruth bumped her shoulder. "And letting people help you when they want to." Charlotte smiled, eyes bright. "That too." As twilight deepened, Charlotte gathered everyone, children, neighbors, even newcomers, to sit around a fire pit in the yard. Wild Spirit stood just beyond the circle, the flames reflected in his calm eyes. Charlotte spoke softly, telling the story of the Mustang's rescue, the long road of healing, and the courage it took for both of them to trust again. "I learned that even the bravest among us are afraid sometimes," she said. "But courage isn't loud. It's a quiet choice, to keep showing up, to be gentle, to hope. And healing. Healing isn't about forgetting the pain. It's about choosing to love anyway." As the fire crackled and the stars came out, Charlotte looked around at the faces glowing in the firelight. Her community, her family, the people who had come together out of hope and heartache. She felt a deep, fierce joy, and knew that no matter what storms came, they would face them together. Autumn returned to Lane Ranch, crisp and gold. The world seemed to slow down, the air thick with the scent of drying hay and the faint promise of wood smoke on cold evenings. Leaves fluttered down, swirling around the paddock where Wild Spirit, no longer thin or skittish, but strong, sleek, and proud, trotted in the late sunlight. The scars on his legs had faded to faint pale lines, reminders of what he had survived, not signs of defeat. Charlotte moved through her days with a quiet purpose, tending the animals, answering calls, making lists for the growing sanctuary. The ranch had become more than just a home. It was a gathering place for the hopeful, the wounded, and the lost, a living testament to what kindness and perseverance could build. There were more animals now. Rescued dogs, a trio of stubborn goats, even a pair of aging donkeys. Children's laughter and the low murmur of adult voices filled the air. It had been nearly a year since she first saw Wild Spirit chained and broken. Sometimes Charlotte still paused in the doorway at dusk, remembering that desperate moment, the silent vow she'd made to herself and to the trembling Mustang. She knew now that single choice had changed everything, not just for Wild Spirit, but for herself and for a community that had learned how to come together. The annual Harvest Festival arrived, a celebration of hard work and new beginnings. For the first time, Lane Ranch was the heart of it all. Charlotte hung bright banners on the old barn. Neighbors strung lights through the trees, turning the paddock into a place of warmth and music. Tables overflowed with pies and casseroles. Someone brought a battered guitar. Wild Spirit stood at the fence, calm as children approached, many of whom had once been too timid even to touch his mane. As the sun dipped low, Charlotte was asked to speak at the festival's gathering. She hesitated at first, heart fluttering with nerves, but Ruth squeezed her hand, and the faces around her, old friends, new neighbors, even the sheriff and his family, radiated support. She stepped onto the hay bale stage, the words finding her as she looked at Wild Spirit, who stood watching her, ears perked and eyes gentle. "I never imagined this ranch would become what it is today," Charlotte began. her voice steady but thick with emotion. "A year ago, I was grieving, alone, barely able to take care of myself, much less a wild Mustang in need of a miracle. But sometimes, the world puts a choice in front of you, a choice to turn away, or a choice to step forward, even when you're scared. That's what happened when I found Wild Spirit. I couldn't turn my back on him, and I'm glad I didn't." She looked down at the children clustered near the fence, then up at the neighbors who had helped rebuild the ranch. "We all have scars. Some you can see, some you can't. Wild Spirit taught me that those scars don't have to define us. What matters is how we respond, whether we let pain close our hearts or use it to open them wider." People in the crowd nodded, some wiping tears, others holding hands. The kids leaned forward, rapt. This ranch became a place of healing, not just for Wild Spirit, but for all of us. We learned together that true strength isn't about fighting or winning. It's about compassion, patience, and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. It's about giving second chances and believing that change is possible. Charlotte's voice broke a little, but she pressed on. "Sometimes, you don't realize how much your actions matter. But the smallest act of courage can start a chain reaction that changes lives. Not just your own, but a whole community's. I see it every day. In every child who learns to trust a frightened horse. In every neighbor who shows up to help. In every story shared in this barn." She glanced at Ruth, at the sheriff, at families who had come to believe in Lane Ranch and in themselves. "If there's one thing Wild Spirit and I want you to remember, it's this. Every living soul deserves a second chance. Every scar holds a story, but it doesn't have to hold you back. Healing is messy, slow, sometimes painful, but it's always worth it. And you're never alone in it. We're all in this together." A hush fell, then applause swelled, gentle at first, then louder, rolling across the crowd like the wind over the prairie. Children darted to Wild Spirit, hugging his strong neck. Parents snapped photos, and neighbors shook Charlotte's hand. The festival continued late into the night. Laughter and music mingled with the soft nickering of horses and the comforting sounds of home. Later, as lanterns glowed and the crowd drifted away, Charlotte stood at the paddock with Wild Spirit. She ran her hand along his neck, feeling the warmth of his breath and the steady heartbeat beneath his skin. "You saved me as much as I saved you," she whispered. "We did this together." Wild Spirit nuzzled her, and Charlotte let herself finally cry. Not tears of grief, but of gratitude, hope, and the strange, beautiful courage that comes from loving and being loved. The ranch, once silent and broken, now thrummed with life. It was a haven for the lost, the healing, the hopeful, a place where every being could become more than their scars. Charlotte understood, as she gazed at the horizon streaked with stars, that real strength came not from conquering, but from choosing to love again and again, no matter the cost. The single choice she'd made to save Wild Spirit had changed both their lives and set off ripples that would be felt for generations, a legacy of compassion, courage, and hope. As the festival lights faded and dawn crept over the fields, Charlotte smiled, knowing the story was not ending, but only beginning. On Lane Ranch, every day was a second chance, and every soul, human or animal, was home.